4020 not live. It's Monday, 23rd of November. I'm in isolation, as you can see here in sunny Wakefield. Phil is not in isolation, but like us all, he's stuck in the leafy suburbs of North Leeds. As it's grand final week, and we're not at Old Trafford doing a press conference, which is quite exciting, because that's tomorrow. Hopefully we'll be bringing you the best bits of that over the week. How excited are you, Phil, for grand final week?
I am relief as much as anything. I think, a lot of hard work by a lot of people, particularly unsung. I mean, we quite rightly focus on the players, and what they've done is astonishing and for less money, and that should never be forgotten. And the prospect of any sort of welfare out of the window, which again should not be forgotten. But there's a lot of staff at clubs, central administration, who've done an astonishing job just to get us to where we are. And I don't think we'll realise probably until the last light is turned off at the KCOM Stadium on Friday night that it has been such an effort. And whilst the NRL, quite rightly point to the biggest crowd in the world in the COVID era for the third State of Origin game, which was fantastic, and they'd managed it in a different way because of the level of COVID that they've had to deal with. We have had the most difficult season probably in the sport's history, in terms of the fact that no fans, not the number of games we wanted, agility and the ability to have to change fixtures at the very last minute, and we've got to a grand final. So first of all, that's an amazing achievement in itself. That was the goal that everybody set out and said, look, if we're going to do this, there has to be meaning, and the biggest meaning you can have is look at the roll of honour and add another team to it at the end of the season. And whether it's Wigan or St Helens, they'll be the fitting winners. They are the two best teams in the competition. We're assuming at this stage that nobody hopefully gets that horrible app on their phone shining saying playing the grand final, and Warrington and or Catalan are asking, being asked to warm up at the last minute. But let's assume it is Wigan and Saints. Then it's a fitting end to what's been a difficult season. It should be a great game. If it's anything like the match we saw between the two of them a month ago, I think arguably we'd all agree that was the best game of the season. So if we can have a repeat of that on a neutral venue, if the light show means that the players feel special, if it's anything like the Challenge Cup final was in terms of making an occasion out of something that is an incredibly difficult circumstance, then we should all be immensely proud, and anybody associated with the sport should tune in on Friday night, boost the viewing figures and revel in the fact that it was tough, but we got there.
Yeah, we're going to have a Wigan perspective on things today from Phil Wilkinson. We will have a Saints guest later in the week, so don't think we're biased against Saints, as some people do. It's a shame there's not going to be a new name on the trophy, but as I pointed out on social media last week, and loads of people have said the same as well, it's not the fault of Wigan and Saints that they're in the grand final. It's up to the other teams to actually catch up with them, and it's fair play to them that they've been able to do it for so long.
Yeah, I also think that, again, things like that are not how you measured this particular season. We always said it was going to be about who had the best youngsters. Well, Wigan and Saints have, for years, had the best nursery. They were going to have to spread those resources. A number of matches we saw every team play where they had to put in some of their younger players. Now, a lot of those played probably a lot more game time expected, so the best of those have made the biggest impact over the course of the season, and those two teams are amongst the ones that consistently have the best youngsters. I think Saints started off the season relatively slowly because they had the World Club Challenge to focus on. They came back from lockdown as the most impressive team, but a couple of occasions since, there's been, their dominance has been exposed, which means that we don't have an absolute out-and-out favourite going into the final. And Wigan have done what Wigan always do, and that is crept under the radar a little bit, peaked when it mattered at the end of the season and got to a grand final. And as you say, yeah, great. Judge next year where hopefully we've got a full season and everybody's recruited in time and everybody's had the length of pre-season they need to bed in their new signings. And we had Salford in a grand final last year. Let's not forget they didn't win it, but that was a new name in the final. I just think 2020 will go down as the year of just having to make the best of everything, and it's not a surprise that two of the best organised teams have got to.
You mentioned Salford. Ian Watson we knew was leaving. We knew he was off to Huddersfield. Then it was confirmed last week on the telly. He was there in some wonderful Sky studios outside the DW Stadium. Not a surprise he's going there, of course, and it'd be interesting now to see the job he can do with the Huddersfield side, who I don't want to say some could say have been sleeping giants for a long time because they haven't been at the top. I know they won the league leaders in 8 years or so ago, but they haven't been at the top table. We're going back to the 60s, aren't we, for Huddersfield?
I think that's the important thing why he's gone more than anything. It's potential. And it links in exactly what you just said about new names in the grand final. And he said that, the setup that he sees there is a top four setup. Right, okay. Well, you've got the coach you wanted. You've got some of the young players coming through that you wanted in Aidan Caesar, who's one of the 5 potential Man of Steel winners. We're recording this just before that decision is made, but he's in one of the new players in the dream team. I think they've got the ingredients they need for a period of sustained success. And I think what you said about that League Leaders Shield win is absolutely right. To win it 1 year as a one-off doesn't change the status quo. You've got to be up there every year. And we've seen Warrington have got close, but they've touched some silverware, but not the one that they've been asked to. We've seen that, Huddersfield have made the semis occasionally, but not mounted a concerted year-on-year challenge. Maybe Ian Watson is that missing ingredient. I think it's vital for him, as he said, that he took Greg Brown with him. I think Luke Robinson is still going to be involved, which is, that's a young and exciting and vibrant coaching staff. We saw that, Castleford had a highlight year, but hadn't as yet sustained or built on the back of that. And I think that's the excitement that Watson sees, that getting to 2 finals with Salford was astonishing. But every year the price of that is to rebuild the team. And I think what he wants is the ability to go in there and say, I've identified A, B, C and D as the players I'm going to build my team around. I've identified, E, F, G and H as the young stars that if they make their progression count, then they're going to be the next generation coming through. And there's still a bit of shaping that I want to do with guys that I might want to bring in that knows the way and the style that I play. But he can see the fact that there's stability there. And with the greatest respect to Salford, they're not at a point where they can offer him that at the moment. So, yeah, I think it's exciting for the competition that we might have another contender, that when we sit down at the beginning of the next season and we're all doing our ridiculous predictions as to what's going to happen, we might stick Huddersfield now as a top 4 and a top 5 rather than a bottom 4 and a bottom 5. So I can see why they've courted him. I can see why he's going there. I can see why some Salford fans would think that he's not necessarily progressing. He's going to a club perhaps of similar standing or perhaps slightly behind them where Salford are at the moment in terms of finals they've been to. But yes, let's hope it equals the competition. And I understand as well he can live at home. He's got family connection, I think, with somebody in Huddersfield who's studying there at the moment. It all sort of fits for Ian Watson. If Hull can get the right coach, they've clearly got a core of players that they can work with. Every year we say, Catalan have got the potential to be something. Well, they've had a taste of a semi-final now. They've won the Challenge Cup final a couple of years ago. Can they now replicate that every year? Let's hope that next year, normal rugby environment with regular fixtures on a weekly basis rather than the kind of understandably ad hoc nature that we've had to have this year. We're talking about maybe 6 or 7 teams that could get to the grand final. Fingers crossed.
I mean, we know who's going to Huddersfield. We don't know who's going to Hull just yet, although Brett Hodgson's been heavily rumoured, reported plenty of times by John Davidson on that one. Salford, it seems that every name is being thrown into the hat, so no one's got a real clue on that one just yet. So there's still plenty of machinations to come over the next few weeks, because we've got to get ready for a new season, which will start in March, which is going back to where we went in 1996.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, first of all, the players need a rest. And first and foremost, I think we've seen, I don't really follow football, but I'm told by people who do that there's been an impact of not having a proper pre-season to almost go from one straight into the other. It is going to affect the ability of teams to be at their best when they need to be. So I think giving them a long break in a year that runs up to a World Cup is absolutely right. Again, following the news and the medical speculation, that there is a chance that by March, whatever vaccine will have been rolled out to sufficient amount of people to have crowds back in grounds. I think you need that. My good lady and I were watching the semi-finals on the television, and I think we've got to the point now where the crowd noise is intrusive rather than an add-on. I think there was a novelty value about it at the beginning, where we were so unsure of what a game would be like played with nobody there, that to have that, grafted on atmosphere actually worked. It gave it some meaning. I think now you get to the point where actually you just want to hit, you want to hear what the players are saying to each other. You want to hear Sky apologising every 5 minutes for a word you may have picked up that you shouldn't have done. But that artificiality comes across in the crowd noise now. So I think, watching the State of Origin this week, go Queensland, 50,000 people in the stadium. Whilst I loved the game and I thought there was a lot to admire about the play, what struck me was how much I'd forgotten the influence of a crowd. And it was a very passionate and it was a very one-eyed crowd, as you would expect in Brisbane when Queensland are playing. But it lent to the whole enchantment of the occasion, and we're desperate for that. And I think if we can start in March and have a little element of that, even if it's only half full stadiums, then that is going to be so much more of an enjoyable experience. And I think March is right. It feels right. I think all of the ingredients will make it right. I'm slightly concerned that they're going for 27 rounds, because again, if you work that across the calendar, and I'm hoping that Sean Wayne will get at least one mid-season international to prepare for the World Cup. You're looking at maybe 3 weeks where you might have teams playing Thursday, Tuesday, or gaps of maybe 4 days between matches on 2 or 3 occasions. That, I know the squads will be slightly bigger because we're not having a reserve grade, but that worries me. That, again, player welfare is being sacrificed to get a certain number of games in. But no, March is right. I hope that becomes a template for the future. And I think, the players need to get away. They need to have December off and a decent pre-season and build up to a massive World Cup. And I think, again, without endlessly talking across you and people turning off going, for goodness sake, shut up. How good to see the World Cup getting a principal sponsor as well, and it being somebody new in an area of commerce that we don't have a great take up at the moment in the e-commerce. Absolutely fantastic. Hats off again to the World Cup organisers, and I just hope they get the tournament that they're building for. And if we need to taper our domestic season to accommodate that, then let's do it.
And it's interesting, obviously rugby league and football, two completely separate sports in terms of impacts on the body, but two managers in the last week or so, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer of Man United, Jurgen Klopp of Liverpool, talking about the impact of the amount of games they're playing in a short space of time, but also having to travel in midweek to Europe and back. I mean, we just had the ridiculous international break in football where people have flown all over the world and caught coronavirus. What a surprise. If I guess we're hamstring out. It's all about money, and we've got to get all these fixtures in. And it's. I hope we do see a lot of rotation next year and a lot of those young players given chances, because the World Cup is going to be very important. Not necessarily that England win it, because I'm not sure if the world was perfect we'd win it, but we've got to put on a great competition where people fall on BBC One and watch Tonga versus Cook Islands, which probably won't be on BBC One, and enjoy a great World Cup, and we're all building up to that. We're all excited. A man who's not going to be involved in England, of course, is Wayne Bennett. But the Super Coach strikes again, and there he is. Can't do it in a Great Britain jumper. And who knew that they were just there to sell shirts, or a different kind of shirt. But there he is winning the State of Origin with Queensland, the worst Queensland side ever, apparently.
Yeah, and again, this weekend I watched the documentary that's come out, Once Were Lions, which was an interesting mix of actually record of the tour, but also context of the sport, which I personally really enjoyed and thought they did very well. The one area they did focus on was Wayne Bennett, because presumably he's not the kind of bloke that's going to give intimate access. But you heard him give a couple of team talks. And there weren't so much team talks, so it was just making somebody feel as though they wanted to go out and give the absolute best they could give. There were a couple of occasions on a training field where, let's say, his instructions to his team were very simple and direct, but there's absolutely no doubt that his players would have understood exactly what was expected from him. And I think those snippets, or perhaps almost captured by accident, showed you why he's held in such high esteem by the players that play for him. And he clearly does have the ability to bring the very best out of those who are deemed beforehand to be of lesser value than some of the star names that are playing in the opposition. And going back to your World Cup point, I think the one thing that documentary also emphasised was that we are too myopic when it comes to England. Clearly we want them to win, but it raised two very important questions. One is, what is the point of having Great Britain if you don't have a strong Ireland, Scotland and Wales? So, Mr. Administrators, what are you doing about making them more viable and the mid-season tests having greater value for everybody? I think the other thing it showed, the Rugby League world, as in the global picture of who could be competitive in a World Cup, has never been stronger. You know, there isn't much of a downside of Papua New Guinea winning a home test match when you look at the reaction that had in that country, and when you have the England players saying how knocked out they've been at people knowing their career. I think who was Sergio, that's age catching up with you. One of the players, I wanted to think it was Jackson Hastings, but it was Jermaine McGilvery. You can edit that out so it was seamless. Who says, you know, he got off a bus in Papua New Guinea to go and visit a school and some children, and they were telling him how much they'd enjoyed his performances in the 2017 World Cup, and he can walk down in the centre of Huddersfield and nobody knows who he is. And I think, you know, so to have a strong Papua New Guinea, to see what Tonga have done, to look at the players that are eligible for Samoa, and say, wow, they genuinely could be the next Tonga. To look at the home nations and say, what can we do in a year to make sure that, you know, I saw Gareth Keir's tweet this weekend about Morgan Knowles saying, you know, it's great everybody's fated him and he's in the dream team, but he has forsaken Wales to play for England. And whilst he's a Cumbrian, you know, if we ever want Wales to be the strong nation it should be, then, you know, commit to Wales with the knowledge that you could then pinnacle that by playing for Great Britain. So I think we all need to look at the best way of moving the international game forward in the knowledge that we get that right, and that is a quick win. That's low-hanging fruit at the moment.
I mean, fingers crossed everything goes well next year, but if any of the teams have to pull out of the World Cup, we can always stick Cumbria in like how the New Zealand Maori were in the 2000 World Cup, just randomly. I mean, before we move on to speak to Phil Wilkinson, just reminding me about the World Cup, Lebanon's new coach. I don't know much about his rugby league background, but the former coach of the Wallabies in the last Rugby Union World Cup, Michael Checker, has taken on the mantle of Lebanon's head coach.
Again, it's a real coup for the sport. I think we could have made more of the story. It was supposed to come out last Friday across multiple media outlets, but, you know, hey, a journalist got hold of it and and broke it as exclusive on the Thursday night. And perhaps we didn't make as much of that as we could have done. But it hit a lot of media outlets. And I think once, we get to know who is going to be playing for Lebanon, is it going to be some of the star names in the NRL like in the last World Cup? I know they're going to have a strong domestic commitment in there, and anything up to 6 players. But we had Mitchell Moses playing for Lebanon in the last World Cup, and now 3 years on, he's one of the star names in the NRL and has played for Australia since. With a big name coach and some big name players, great. Let's see what Jamaica do as well. I'm genuinely excited by this World Cup, and I think timing wise, it might just be not only a pick-me-up for rugby league, but for sport in this country as well. If we can stage a big event and stage it well, then I think a lot of people will look at that competition and say, actually, I think, it's a great sport and I've seen it, but the Commonwealth Games coming on the back of that in 2022, and I think it's Women's Football Euros that we're hosting as well, and various other things that have been put back. If rugby league is right up there as one of the first genuinely global tournaments post-pandemic, we could win a lot of friends and influence people. And I think Kazoo have seen that. That's one of the reasons why they want to get involved. And it genuinely is a 7-figure deal. So, it's not free pizza. Which is always good. Hopes
don't play the Human League song The Lebanon when they play the national team, the Cedars. Unlike when I went to a game once at a ground I won't mention because it was a long time ago, in the Challenge Cup when a team from Yorkshire perhaps played Union Tres Catalan, and as they were coming out onto the pitch, played Paul McCartney in the Frog Chorus.
I think that hopefully those days have gone.
Fingers crossed. Right, we'll talk some more non-Wigan stuff in a moment, but now here is Wigan Observer's very own Phil Wilkinson. Where do we start? It's grand final week. Obviously, we're very excited. A different kind of grand final than ever. Phil Wilkinson joining us now from the Wigan Post and the Wigan Observer to get a Wigan perspective on things. Phil, how excited are you? Grand final week.
I know. You normally have Paul Bennett from Wigan. As he ditched you, now he's gone to League Express. Now he's hit the big time.
More diversity from Wigan-based journalists, you see.
Right. That's what it is. Yeah, mate, it's good. It's good. Another grand final, a bit of a surreal grand final to look forward to this week, though. Yeah.
I think we went for eloquence rather than Paul, and better looking, I think, as well. The general public would certainly agree with that. I just think it's good that we've got the grand final that the season deserves. I think we've all spoken throughout the year or written in various places about the fantastic efforts that everybody's put in to get us to this one date in Hull in late November, and it deserves the first 2 ranked teams to play in it. I know that in previous years we've had the excitement of teams maybe coming through the playoffs who haven't finished 1 and 2, but of all the seasons that you wanted as many of the players that have performed the best over the most difficult circumstances, this is the year. And I for one, am absolutely delighted it is Wigan and Saints. I think it's completely apt.
At the derby 3 or 4 weeks ago at the Totally Wicked Stadium, I remember about the hour mark, the game was very much still up in the air. And I remember turning to Mike, who covers St Helens for the St Helens Star, and I said, you know what, whoever wins this game, I don't care. I hope this is a grand final. Not to say it necessarily deserved to be, because obviously if a team had won in a semi-final, they'd have deserved it. But I did feel that the intensity of that derby, I just hoped, whatever the result of that derby 3 or 4 weeks ago, that would have been the grand final. And so I'm pleased with that on that front, yeah. We are presuming that all the COVID tests come back negative here, Phil.
I also think that, with the greatest respect to the other 2 teams in the semi-finals, and we can talk about how they actually panned out as matches, the truth is, the playoffs were extended. Hull was 6th, and their record was virtually 50% for the season. And obviously the Dragons played less games than everybody else through, as we've all said, nobody's fault. It's just the way things have panned out. So for either of or both of those two to have made the grand final, they would have deserved it, but all of the effort would have been sort of undermined by the two of them being centre stage, if you like.
Yeah, completely agree on that front, mate. I mean, I thought with Hull last week, going back to that derby I mentioned, Wigan St Helens, they were flat the week after when they played Huddersfield, and they all said that the derby had taken a lot out of them. And going back to that Hull performance against Warrington, I just felt like that was almost, we got so up for that game, that was almost the final, and I didn't think they'd be able to back that up a week after. I know people were saying, oh, they're battle hardened, they've got momentum going into it, but you ask for players, and a lot of them will say it does take, when you see such a high, intense performance from a side, it is hard to back that up 6 days later. And I thought that's what you probably saw with Hull. I thought you would have needed Wigan to have been off to have lost that game. And Saints were always going to beat Catalan, especially after the disciplinary of Mickey Mackin, especially with him being ruled out. I didn't think Catalan had a chance.
The shame for both of the teams that lost was that underpinning both of their performances was their own indiscipline, and I don't think there could be any argument that the scoreline reflected the fact that you can talk all day about whether Josh Griffin's incident was worthy of a penalty or not. Yes, we see a lot of players, if you like, getting in the face of their opponents if they can see an advantage, but that was more like a scene out of Benny Hill. It deserved a penalty. I think the Dragons at the moment, to me, and we've spoken about this before, and I know you looked at it as well, because there's a strong Wigan core that runs through that team at the moment. To me, they just seem to have lost their identity. The first thing you think about of a team that represents France is that they play open, attractive, uncompromising rugby. And they've lost the open and attractive bit and just retained the uncompromising.
Yeah, they're certainly a niggly side, aren't they? That whole penalty, I mean, I think it was about, I want to say this time last year. Obviously, this time last year would have been the off-season. But about the playoffs last year, when they almost introduced that rule where they kind of said we're going to clamp down on that kind of gamesmanship. And I remember a couple of days later, Oliver Gildart got pinged for a penalty for a similar offence. And I remember Adrian Lam saying at the time, look, if you're going to not change the rules, but kind of change a directive where you're enforcing a particular rule, don't do it mid-season. Do it at the start of the year. And so that rule has been in place all of this year, albeit it's been an interrupted year. And it obviously was a turning point where Hull, lost the discipline. Instead of having they'd have had a great position to score there. Instead, it's a penalty to Wigan. To call it the turning point of the game, I thought was a bit of a stretch, because you then have to presume Hull were going to score and then presume that Hull were then going to carry on and going to win. I mean, you keep in mind, Wigan's last game before that, they'd only conceded one try against Huddersfield, one try the week before against St Helens, two against Salford the previous game. Their defence has been pretty good these last few weeks, so I didn't think it was the defining turning point, but it was obviously an early flashpoint, and from that point, Wigan took a grip of that game and never let go.
So I want to talk about Adrian Lam, you just mentioned there. Obviously, go back a couple of years now, Sean Wayne's leaving. Adrian Lam's coming in as a kind of set-up man for Sean Edwards. Sean Edwards doesn't come. Adrian Lam takes the job on full-time. Midway through last season, Leeds get rid of David Ferner. At a similar time, Wigan could obviously have partly come in with Adrian Lam, but they go on and win the League Leaders' Shield this year, get to the grand final. Tell us about the job he's done and what kind of a coach you see from the sidelines.
Yeah, well, when he came in, you're right. He was in an awkward position from the start, wasn't he? He had to kind of warm the seat, basically, for Sean Edwards. And then there was all that controversy about Edwards' U-turn, and he had to weather all of that. Didn't do too bad last season. I mean, it was almost a little bit of a transitional season as well, with Bateman and Tompkins leaving, and obviously the loss of Sean Wayne. And then he was under the cosh a little bit this year to kind of... I remember Ian Lenigan saying a few years ago that he expected a trophy every other year, and that was a directive to Sean Wayne, which I always thought was a bit of a high yardstick for any coach, to be honest, in the Super League with a salary cap. But that was it. He made no bones about it. I mean, towards the end of Wayne's tenure, it almost became a situation where he had to win a trophy every other year and do it in a particular style, which I thought was definitely a very hard thing to ask. With Lam, the thing that I was looking forward to seeing was the way he was promised to make him a little bit more attractive, play a bit more of a flamboyant style, a bit more off the cuff, switching the halfback so he could go left and right. And what's impressed me more hasn't even been that. It's just been the way, firstly, he's kept his composure and cool. You got to remember when Wigan got stuffed at London early last year, early into his reign, he kept his composure then. When all the Sean Edwards thing went on, he kept his composure then. And the other thing I've liked about him has been the way he's promoted the youth players at Wigan, and he's brought them through and kept them in there. A lot is made of the fact that there's two marquee players. Wigan have got George Burgess on board, but he's played 7 games this year. Meanwhile, you've got Ollie Partington starting in the front row with Joe Bullock, who was recruited from Barrow, and a list of others: Smithies, Joe Shorrocks, Liam Burns, who have all come through and kept the place, warranted a place. And he's not been there was always that concern with him coming in for a short time. He might not have been as keen to continue what Wayne had done. And that's really been pleasing for me to see that he has.
I think the player that I think might have benefited the most from having him around, and I think his elevation may have come slightly quicker than perhaps we'd anticipated, is Harry Smith. Because obviously, clearly Lam was one of the great halfbacks that we saw playing for Wigan and PNG and Queensland, and the ultimate competitor, and you'd want to see him almost present the next generation with those qualities. Wigan's forwards are always going to have it. You don't get in the Wigan system if you're not that that kind of a ultra committed player. But it's great, when you've seen the likes of Luke Robinson, Kevin Brown sort of moved on almost prematurely from the Wigan scenario. It's really good to see Harry Smith given an opportunity. Is he going to feature in the 17? Is he going to have a key issue to play in the grand final, do you reckon?
Yeah, I think he will. I mean, we don't know. They were very vague about why Sam Powell was absent last weekend against Hull. I think Lam mentioned family reasons in the press conference. You obviously don't want to press too much on that. So it's the obvious question to ask Lam whether... I don't think Ben Flower will play. I think he's been ruled out by that hamstring injury, which is a sad ending to his Wigan career. Timely Joe Greenwood has served his 2-game ban, will probably come back in. Whether Sam Powell's still absent and Harry Smith will get his chance, we'll ask tomorrow. I think Harry Smith will probably play. The interesting one for me, Phil, is where he's going to play next year, because they've managed to retain Bevan French, Hastings. I expect Tommy Leuluai to play on next season, and then of course they've signed another halfback / fullback in Jay Field. So that'll be the interesting one next year. Where does I agree with everything you just said about Harry Smith, and yet I'm wondering not why they signed Jay Field, because quality teams do just sign quality players, don't they? Whether they need somebody in that position or not, but it's going to be an interesting one how he manages to get them all in that side.
I wondered about Tommy Leuluai, because clearly he still can contribute massively to the team, and if there is an advantage to only playing a foreshortened year, it might extend his career by a year. But is he now an out-and-out backup hooker? And so Powell will be a first choice. Leuluai might come off the bench, and Smith could be a starter with Field. Maybe you've got Hastings then, haven't you? So yeah.
It was interesting last week that everybody expected with Powell out, because Tommy's been playing halfback all year, but everybody expected with Powell out that Tommy would go to dummy half and put Harry Smith on the right side. He didn't do that. He put Jackson Hastings at dummy half. Adrian Lam thinks that is his natural position, which is a big call given how dominant Hastings can be at halfback, and he's a reigning man of steel. I think, though, with what you said about Tommy, he's as good a 9 as he is a halfback, isn't he? He's probably at halfback, to be honest, a short back defence, isn't he? And keep quiet, though, whichever back rower is running down that side. And you're right, at that age of his career, it's probably a wise step to make him almost a bench hooker next season, kind of, he can, like, with Sam Powell. I mean, Sam Powell's been playing 80 minutes regularly. Wigan have often not gone with a bench hooker. So it probably would be a wise step to kind of, given his age, take that bench hooker role, next season and kind of give him that responsibility of, I don't want to say nurture Harry Smith through. Harry Smith's done a fine job, but kind of hand over that baton so that he is, fully prepared for the following year in 2022.
I mean, we don't know how close they were to leaving, whether it was just internet rumours or whatever, but the re-signing of Jackson Hastings and Bevan French, two big signings, not just for the competition, obviously, but for Wigan itself going forward and building on this side, which is obviously 80 minutes away from the Championship.
Yeah, great news for Wigan, as you say, and Super League. I mean, I'm sure both of them would have had plenty of offers in the NRL. Wouldn't surprise me if Rugby Union were looking at them, or other Super League clubs. So great news for Wigan as well as a competition. The other thing to consider with Tommy, Phil, is he's got that agreement with Wigan to go join a coaching staff next season. Now, they've already got an additional coach joining with Sean O'Loughlin. They've got one fewer team to coach because there's no reserves next year. You don't need another coach joining the staff with Tommy Leuluai going on board. So it does make sense. That's why they expect him to play on next season as well.
In terms of, you mentioned salary cap, you mentioned George Burgess, you mentioned Jai Field coming in, the re-signing of French and Hastings, which won't have been cheap, I wouldn't have thought, and nor should it be, because they're two of the absolute superstars of the competition. I actually think that French re-signing is probably more of a surprise and welcome than Hastings, because we know that Hastings has got a bit of a love-hate relationship with the NRL, but French would have been admired from afar for what he's done this year and walk into any team in the world. And when we start talking about who's likely to be the man of steel, then I don't think anybody would complain if he was. He's been that good. But what would you do with Burgess? Because obviously he's taken up a huge chunk of the salary cap. If we assume that obviously Summer's been released by Sean O'Loughlin's retirement, Tommy Leuluai most likely will play on, otherwise they're doing a chunk of salary cap there. Can they afford to keep George Burgess, or do you think he'll be moved on to accommodate this exciting array of backs they're going to have?
Yeah, I don't know, because, I mean, financially, they'll have a little bit with Joe Burgess moving on. I think he's going to Salford. They've also got quite a few fringe players like your Jack Wells, who I think is going to Salford. Craig Mullen's already signed for Lee. A few others off contract that will probably depart. A couple of probably just go on loan. And you don't know how much of that it is taken up by the cap. That's the trouble we always have, isn't it, when we're reporting these stories? We're almost guessing. It's guesswork on the figures. You don't quite know how much they're earning. You can probably guess a ball point and you'd probably not be too far off. The other thing to consider is these young players we talk about. A lot of them have incremental contracts. So every year, they get an extra £10,000 or £20,000 put on their contract. You get a handful of those. That eats into the cap every time you progress in a year. So, to answer your question, I think Wigan can afford to keep him on. He's got a 3-year contract. If you're George Burgess, you would dig your heels in and expect to be here next season. But if he is, we're going to have to ask and expect a lot more than what we've seen from him this year. It's been unfortunate with this hip injury, and he has to get that right. 7 games, and the games he's played, it's been limited minutes. Certainly not been the impact that I think anyone expected. And I'm sure he's as disappointed, well, more disappointed than anyone with the impact he's had on Super League this season. That'll be one to watch, that, Phil. George Burgess, what happens with him. As I say, he's got a contract. We'll have to wait and see.
I think we also know the salary cap will be less next year. Now, whether that's explicitly less or it's just a gentleman's agreement that the £300,000 each team has got to pay back to Sky is the salary cap they're working to. That we don't know yet, do we? Well,
I tell you what, though, but I believe every single club, when they say that they've been hard hit by COVID, I'm sure they have. But I expected it to have more of an impact, I must say, on not only next year's plans, but on the back end of this season. I mean, they all took pay cuts, and yet a lot of the clubs recruited and strengthened the squads for the back end of the season, even though they expected crowds to be back in and they weren't. Now, whether that's because they asked season ticket holders not to claim a refund and that there was a high uptake on people who didn't, I don't know, but I was expecting there to be a lot less recruitment across the board than there has been already for next year. I don't know whether I can't explain it. I don't know about you. I don't know how you thought about that. I just thought I was. I mean, given the quality of the players that some of these clubs are signing as well.
I think that also applies at championship level. I think some of the recruitment that's been done there, and clearly that is a reflection, as you've said, of not having a reserve grade next year, not having the dual registration system. So it's going to be more of players on the market, perhaps, who would have been stockpiled by Super League teams in the event that they needed to run the reserve side as well. But some of the recruitment in the Championship makes it a really exciting division, and there's been a lot more movement there than I thought there was going to be. I pretty much thought most squads would go with what they had, but that is going to be a fine competition in its own right, irrespective of the political machinations of one of their teams joining Super League and a League One team joining the Championship.
It's a bugbear of mine, though, mate, that they made an early decision to bin off the reserves next season because they couldn't afford it. No excuses. It's a cost-cutting exercise. And then at the same time, in the subsequent weeks, we've seen so much spending and so much recruitment for 2021. I'd have preferred. I do feel genuinely sorry for any player who's 20, 21 years old who will be left, from what we can see, in limbo next season. And it goes back to what we had a couple of years ago, and it's just unfair, and it's just ridiculous, the system that they had. Whether they extend the academy age group next year or manage it with dual reg, I'm not too sure. But the sooner they get that reserves up and running properly, a proper competition, the better for me.
I think that's the word, properly. It's either done regulated and everybody buys in, everybody enters a team. There's a performance aspect allied to it, as well as just the participation one, because you got to ask, why did something stop in the first place? And I think one of the reasons was the reserve grade wasn't doing what we all hoped it might and what it was originally when A teams existed, and that was bringing back players who were injured, or the next generation of young players, or possibly even signing a rugby union trialist, or it had a meaning in its own right. And what it became towards the end was just a way of fulfilling fixtures. And we lost the essence of it. So I think if we got that back and everybody bought into that and spent sufficient on it to make it worthwhile and viable, yes.
What was wrong? Do you remember why, or whether there was any complaints with the old? The last one we had, I think, was an 18s and an 18s academy and a 21s, which would allow like 3 open age players, for example. I think it was about 2010 or 2011. I went to a grand final at Knowsley Road. Must have been 2010 then. And the Wigan side had, I think Amos Roberts was in there, and Cameron Phelps, Carl Price. It had like 3 or 4 open age players in the 21 side. I don't know why that system was ditched, to be honest. I don't know why they went to an Academy 19s. I thought it worked quite well.
I'm with you on that. I think that's where it has to have a purpose. And I think even if you took it to under 23s, we'd even seen, when we're old enough to remember, Great Britain had an under 24 side. As long as there's a cut-off date that says, there is a reason for developing players. It's not just a retirement home. Or, as it turned out, as I remember when it started coming to an end, there was a lot of raiding of community clubs just to fill out teams. So you were giving players an opportunity who you were never going to sign as a Super League professional. So, picking names completely at random, we're going to go to St Pat's and know they had an 18 fixture and take 8 of their players, and maybe St Pat's to get 50 quid for the privilege of it. But those 8 players weren't being groomed to be professional rugby league players, and that demeaned the fixture in some ways. And it also probably meant they wouldn't play for St Pat's that weekend, which was no help to anybody. I think we just got away from the point of what 18 rugby should have been about. And I think putting age levels in it, and you get that step up then to producing a Super League player who's played against men, if you like, which is why we brought in dual registration with championship clubs, because it was almost that physical test that they needed more than anything, rather than a skills test. If you can build that back into whatever you call reserve grade, then it's got to have a value.
We'll see when it comes back in another form in the next 2 years or so. It might have something to do with the tea reader whenever that comes in. We need to talk about a key man who's going to obviously play his last game this weekend for Wigan, and that's Sean O'Loughlin. Phil, you've watched his whole career, I guess, in the cherry and white. How important? Well, it's a daft question. We all know the answer, but talk to us about Sean O'Loughlin. I don't need to ask a question. Tell us about it.
Yeah, there's plenty of scandal. I'm only kidding, obviously. Do you know what? For his last game on Friday or Thursday, at the DW, I dug up the match report from his debut, and my introduction. He was in the opening line. It was something along the lines of, between the enterprise of Jason Smith and the finesse of Brett Dallas, a reluctant star announced himself last night. And it sounds almost prophetic that I would do that, but honestly, the amount of fringe players who I've declared as the next superstar who've only played 2 more games is ridiculous. But I managed to get that one right. He's still that reluctant star, isn't he? I've just done a piece of a grand final program, and I just thought I'd just check his social media, and I think the last post on Twitter was about 6 weeks ago, and even that was just sharing a Rugby League Cares initiative. He's just not one for the limelight. The biggest, I spoke to Moz last week when he announced his retirement, and Moz said that as much as we all rate him, the players put him on another level. And he said the best example of that was that we don't see, not how hard he hits and things like that, but also the confidence he gives the teammates. And also, I'll flip it on its head, the confidence it gives the opposition when he's absent. And he says, we don't see that, and it's been hard trying to find anyone to say anything bad about him in his last few weeks, isn't it? But he's deserved everything that comes his way. I mean, I've been watching his career for nearly 19 years. The impact he has on that side, the influence he has is just incredible. And for me, to stay loyal in the professional era, when he had so many options to go to the NRL, spoken to so many clubs, linked with so many clubs over the years, but to stay loyal to one club, your hometown club, in this era, for me, just it puts him right up there. It's hard, it's dangerous to rate somebody's legacy so soon and when it's raw, but I think there's no risk that he will go down as one of Wigan's all-time greats.
Phil, you could have got linked at one point.
Well, I think there's 2 things about him. I think the first thing is we've seen a lot of great players. We've seen a lot of players who we would deem to be our favourite players. But there are certain players that come along, and there aren't many of them, who actively change games the minute they take a hand in them. And, whether it's the first 15 minutes of a game, whether it's coming off a bench, whether it's the crucial last 5 minutes, you always look to a certain player who is associated with a certain club who is going to make the right play, who's going to turn that game around. Fortunate enough to see Ellery Hanley at his pomp. He was one of them. You knew whenever he got the ball and it was that decisive moment in a game, he was going to provide it. You looked at Wally Lewis in the international arena. I think, whenever Great Britain were looking like they were going to win a test match, or it got to that point where suddenly Australia were under pressure, Wally Lewis would do something. To the same extent, Darren Lockyer might as well. There are very few players that define matches by what they do. Sean O'Loughlin is one of them. There is absolutely no doubt that every fan of every club would say they knew he was going to do something when it really mattered in the biggest of big games. And that is the mark of not just being a great player, but being one of the greatest players. I think the other thing is, talking from a perspective of when he could have left, you ask why clubs would be interested in taking him. And there is no doubt that 2 years ago, when Kevin Sinfield wanted to rebuild whatever culture is in a sports dressing room, the one player he wanted to bring in was Sean O'Loughlin. And it wasn't just paper talk at the time. There really was something behind it. And what it was not what he could bring on the field. I think everybody knew that he was coming towards the end of his career and injuries were going to take their toll. They wanted him at the club because they knew that having him at the club would change the whole direction of the club. The nearest they could get to Jamie Peacock returning, for example. And again, I think when people within the game start telling you that we need this guy because his influence is so much more than what you see with him with a ball in his hand, you realise how special he is. And going back to the grand final and why it's apt and appropriate, if we can have Sean O'Loughlin and James Graham on opposite sides going out on this end, field together, that's brilliant because they both deserve it. They have been amongst the best we've seen for very different reasons. But O'Loughlin is the epitome of the modern rugby league player. The fact that he could be in every dream team because there hasn't been a loose forward to surpass him, even if he's only played 5 games that year, you still went, my default position is Sean O'Loughlin has to be the loose forward. That tells you everything. He has been the most astonishing servant.
I almost want to say he's almost the last loose forward in the way that he plays that. We grew up watching the loose forwards. They seem to be an extra back row, an extra half-back these days, but Sean O'Loughlin could do everything.
Yeah, I remember a game at Catalan a couple of years ago. I think they were 17, 18 points down, and Sean O'Loughlin, I think George Williams went off, and so he moved to half-back, and he literally, what Phil just said is spot on, he literally did just take that game by the scruff of the neck and got them the win, and Steve McNamara just full of praise afterwards. Even that World Club Challenge last year, Trent Robinson, full of praise for him, wasn't he? Just saying he was the standout player in that World Club Challenge defeat that Wigan had against the Roosters. So yeah, great servant. And as you said, Phil, what a fitting finale. I hope James Graham, I don't know the head knock protocols. I hope he is playing because that would be the fitting send off, albeit without any fans voting it's at Hull.
Well, this is payback. You say Super League have paid back for all those times Darryl Powell's moaned about having to go across to the Totally Wicked Stadium throughout the year. Now everyone has to go the other way.
Well, there was a Hull derby at St Helens, wasn't there, a few weeks ago? So I suppose this has been flipped on its head. Hey, Phil, let me ask you two. You mentioned that he was in the dream teams then. How do you think the Legends dream team is compared to the one that you guys would have picked?
I haven't shared mine on social media because I don't see enough games live to have an opinion. That isn't going to be pilloried by everyone. So I'm not confident enough to put my head above the parapet. But Phil knows more than I do.
I don't know.
Tanganoa definitely deserve to be in there. I'll say that.
I just think dream teams are really difficult concepts this season because, again, conditions have been such that it's almost impossible to draw a form line from week to week. There's been too many games, too many injuries, too many people playing when they've been needled up. So I think it's really difficult. The artificiality of playing behind closed doors, which is to the absolute credit of everybody who's run out there, but it's not the same. I also think Phil wrote a really good piece about the provenance of how you decide who should be in the dream team, and now it's moved away from journalists, which is probably not a bad thing in itself, through to, the Man of the Match awards for the Man of Steel. And again, people who put their hands on the ball a lot win awards, and they're not necessarily the people that win the games. And I know that we probably all worked where you're asked to mark players, and you're almost doing that at the end of a game. And what do you remember most? Do you remember either the key incidents or the people that were around the ball the most? I think that the problem, I think, is you should never pick a man of the match till you've got the match statistics. And Scully would always argue that there's only one statistic that matters, and that's the scoreboard. But the fact is, effort and influence, and Sean O'Loughlin is a classic example of that, is measured in a lot of different ways. And one of the ones is to look at the overall stats, which is involvement over that 80 minutes. And it could well be that somebody who perhaps hasn't been mentioned a lot in commentary has been by far the best player on the pitch. And I think the other thing is we don't know what players are asked to do. We're not privy to the fact that a coach has said to them, your job today is not offload the ball. What I want you to do is run hard and straight on the edge at that particular defender every time you get the ball. And then you look at the game and you go, well, he didn't do a lot today. And the coach is putting his arm around the back of the player coming off going, you did exactly what I wanted you to do. So there's lots of flaws in the whole concept. But I just think at the moment, I can't argue with some of the choices. I think we'll all have our favourite who we want to win it. And a lot of it is about philosophy and style of play. But I'm just not sure the process is quite there at the moment.
I'm with you, mate. I'm all for the Legends having I think we don't do enough actually to involve former players, especially from a pre-Super League era. So I'm all for involving them and having them pick out pick out ultimately who should win it. But this system, you mentioned because this is off a Man of Steel leaderboard. So it's supposed to be who had the biggest impact on that season. And the way of gauging it is who's got the most man of a match awards, effectively, the 3-2-1s. And I just think, as you mentioned, the halfbacks and the hookers are people who do touch the ball. And especially the ones that was... I think over a few years you'll get a pattern here, Phil. I think the players who are at the bigger clubs will win fewer of these Man of Steels because it's harder for them, in my opinion, to get these Man of Steel points. I think they got it right, actually, last year with Jackson Hastings at Salford. But if I remember right at the time, he thought Lomax should have been up for the award. And, of course, Lomax would have been competing with Lachlan Coote and Luke Thompson, on that leaderboard for the points. And, yeah, I just think you're going to get a lot more halfbacks and hookers at the mid-table sides winning the the most coveted award that we have in the game, and I'm just not too sure this 3-2-1 system's the right way. The Albert Goldthorpe does it in a similar way, doesn't it? The League Express's man of that 3-2-1 their player of the year. You look at who's won at that. I think Danny Bruff's won it 3 times. Scott DeRoe, Michael Dobson. Halfbacks at mid-table sides, and it, in those years they probably had good seasons, but were they? I don't think it marries up with the Man of Steel award, does it? So I don't think they were the best player of the year. So it'll be interesting. We'll probably need a bit more of a time frame, doesn't it, to see whether this system does work. But going to be. I'm with you. I'm a bit sceptical about whether this is the right way.
And it should be an award for the best player of the year, shouldn't it? We just had the Rugby League Writers and Broadcasters Association award come out last week. I was torn between Alex Walmsley and Bevan French up until the last minute, and then I saw the Wigan game against Hull, and I thought, right, I'm going to have to go with Bevan French. And everyone else did as well, so it's all right. And that is, you choose who you think has been the best player of the year. And you're right, it's a flawed system, but it came in because the players couldn't be trusted last time. We voted for the Mits.
No, well, they messed. Yeah, it was their fault, wasn't it? Too many players took the mick. I just think though, when you've got Bevan French and Liam Farrell obviously competing for those points on that leaderboard, it's going to be tougher for them to win the Man of Steel. I'm going to go on, Phil.
I was going to say, I think that if we were all to pick the players that we've enjoyed watching the most this season and we think have had the most impact, and you were going to restrict that to 3 nominees, 2 fullbacks would be in there. I think 2 of the most entertaining and enjoyable players I've seen play this year are Bevan French and Lachlan Coote, but they're not in the voting for Man of Steel. Because obviously they're playing the same position, and I don't know. It's for the dream team. They are in the Man of Steel, so they can't both be in the dream team. But I think that's flawed as well. What you want are Well, we've said it before. There should be 2 awards. Man of Steel should be exactly what it says. So you look at a Liam Farrell, you look at an Alex Walmsley, you look at a James Rovey. They are men of steel. And under the, however you want to define the word steel, and even acknowledging the fact that it was a steel firm that originally brought up the prize for the first award. I think you also needed to have an entertainer of the year. So you've actually got 2 awards that are of equal value, and one is the player that you would pay money to go and see because he gets you off your seat every time and that for me, that's Bevan French this year. Every time he's touched the ball, there's been a frisson of excitement, whoever you support, and that, I would hope, why he would get this major award. There's a feeling that somebody like a Paul McShane or Aidan Caesar might get it because they've figured so high every week in teams that haven't been right at the very peak. And again, you're detracting from what the sport's about in many respects.
It seems to work in the NRL, but you'd probably argue there's a fairer distribution of the talent, isn't there, among the sides that way. But what was interesting, before, when the Man of Steel was picked by the shadowy anonymous panel, and when it was changed from that to become the Players Select the Award, they ditched the Players Player Award. They always used to have that with it, didn't they? Mm. And now they've gone back last year to this new system where this, they've ditched for players can pick it. They've got this, the Legends leaderboard. They've not revived the Players Player Award, so I don't know why that's not been done either. I suppose it would just be whether it's a contradiction if two people kind of get the, two different players get the awards. It's almost whether it undermines that system, but yeah.
We have run out of time because it's going to cut me off in less than a minute. So how many points are we going to win the grand final by, Phil?
I tell you what, maybe should be pretty confident after the last few weeks. They keep going back to that Leeds Cup defeat in the semi-final, and they have been a different side since. But listen, I'm not too confident because anything could happen. Look what's happened in the past before. With red cards or a player withdrawing the day before, and in these COVID crazy times, I'm not going to predict too much. But fingers crossed for me, Phil. But we'll get a Wigan win.
Plenty of spoken there by Phil. And we mentioned Sean O'Loughlin a lot there. Obviously, James Graham we'll talk about later in the week. And Gareth Ellis is retiring again. Not quite getting the same fanfare this time, but I think everything we said about him a couple of years ago still applies. And a great talent who did it on both sides of the world.
Yeah, I think we said that Sean O'Loughlin is I think Phil pointed out, and great to have him on because I wanted him to come on for a very long time. Love the columns he writes analysing the game. It's a player's player thing. I'm not sure that those of us who are absolutely privileged to even talk about this sport fully understand what it means to those that put their everything into it. When they say this is a true great, I don't think we fully appreciate what that actually means. But people who we admire, you look at who they are extolling and you think they must be something absolutely unbelievably special. And there is no doubt that in James Graham, in Sean O'Loughlin and in Gareth Ellis, three of the absolute very, very best. We both had the privilege of seeing Gareth play live when he was at the beginning of his career. You read the testimonials that he got from West Tigers, and not just from the guys he played with, but like with Adrian Morley in the NRL, with the players that he played against that said, wow, goodness me, every week I'm playing this guy. He is something else. There's absolutely relentless about him. He's just so good in everything that he does that when we see his name on the team sheet, we are ultra aware. Astonishing, player of the year 3 times running at Wests and a Pommy to boot. You have to be 6 times as good as everybody else just to even be spoken about. And I think all three have got something in common. Again, James Graham was highlighted in the video we were talking about earlier. Doesn't have the right temperature of frothy milk in his coffee. He can be a prima donna, but everybody will do what he says because he's the ultimate gladiator. They want to follow him. And you watch all of those halftime team talks, and he's doing them. It's not Wayne Bennett. It's not Danny Ward. It's not Ian Watson. It's James Graham. He's the guy who's telling the forwards exactly what's expected of him. He's the guy who's telling the team, exactly what he thinks they can still do, even if they're behind at the break. You look at Sean O'Loughlin, who doesn't say a lot and never has, but the team he plays for is a different team when he's out there on the field, and because he can have such an influence whether he's got the ball in his hands or not. And you look at Gareth Ellis, and I think Gareth wanted a challenge when he came back from the NRL. I don't think it is apocryphal that every single Super League club at least inquired as to his availability. But it came down to effectively 2, and that was going back to Leeds where he'd already made his name. I mean, his first game was winning a World Club Challenge. His last game was winning a Grand Final. So nothing to prove. They wanted him back because they knew what he and Hull. And it wasn't about going back to the familiar and fitting in and being in an environment where he was already proven. It was, no, I'm going to take on that challenge of trying to be the best I can be to bring something to a new club. And I think he'll tell you, in all honesty, that leading the side up those steps at Wembley for the first time that club had lifted the Challenge Cup in the National Stadium, it's probably the proudest domestic moment of his career. And at the age he was at then meant the most to him. Wherever he's gone, What was he, 22, 23 when he was made captain of Wakefield?
Yeah,
It ought to be something pretty special to be given the armband when you're that young. Walked into a Leeds team that, at the time needed leaders, had a lot of incredibly talented young players who were just learning how to win things. But when he joined them, gave them that real physical edge that they needed to keep that going. And then, went to Hull and got them their holy grail. He's one of the nicest people you could ever wish to meet, but also one of the truly great competitors we've seen in our sport. And all three are. That's what they've got in common. Ultimate competitors.
I've just checked on when Ellis played at Standoff, and it was in, I think his greatest performance in the Wakefield shirt was for the playoff game at Hull. I think it was one of the first games at the KC Stadium, and we absolutely battered them that night. We were superb. 28-18. I've just seen the full games on YouTube, so I'm going to have to watch that again. But he was, when he started off in the centres, moved to second row, had to play at 6 because we were desperate. And, a great player. And as you say, one of those, again, as we mentioned with Sean O'Loughlin, mentioned with James Graham, no one's got a bad word about his playing career, have they? Because they just stand there as, I'll say immortals is the wrong word, but legends of their time. And it's interesting, Wigan put Sean O'Loughlin's threat into their Hall of Fame, which we didn't have time to talk to Phil about, but looking at their list, it does seem very recent heavy. I'm sure there are plenty of names from the past who could be in there. That's not for me to say, of course.
I think being involved in a Hall of Fame, drawing up the criteria are really important. And one of the things that should be considered is a length of time for being retired. I think in the Rugby Fame it's 10 years. I think that might be too long. But I think that there is a need for people to step back to know how good you were. And the danger with them in as they unlace their boots is you don't get time to then reflect a little bit further down the line and put them in context and just... I think there's also a reputational thing. If somebody finishes playing and goes off the rails, which none of these three will do, I'm absolutely 100% convinced. But again, you rush to put them on a pedestal, then you run the risk or the danger that the column underneath it might crumble at some stage. But I think a little bit of haste in that. But you've got two options, haven't you? You've got the Kieran Cunningham statue option, doing it a little bit too quickly, or you've got the let's take a step back and give it 5-10 years and then unveil the full majesty of what they meant.
It is a point I make currently about after an Olympics where everyone gets a medal. And I'm thinking, as we've seen with Olympic Games, it takes a long time sometimes for things to come out about athletes. I'm not saying anyone British, but it does. And we've given them all medals. You've got some time to think about this. Although, because I post these old programmes on our Twitter feed, so I've discovered Fred Webster, who now is my favourite player. Scored 8 tries as a forward. I don't know if forwards played differently in those days, and in the era of contested scrums, of course, but he's a player I want to learn more about. I'm going to have to do some research on him, but he's up there with Gary Schofield, shooting post.
From Brotherton. The village between Leeds and Wakefield, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Played first player to play over 500 games for Leeds, and as you say, scored 8 tries in one game, which is still a club record. And was in the first Leeds team to ever win a cup in 1910 when they won the Challenge Cup. So the first Loiner superstar.
But I had to have a proper job and everything. I think there's one last thing I need to talk about before we go today, which is I'm getting a bit bored of the dramas of who's going to fill the 12th place in Super League, because we're a fairly pro-Toronto, pro-expansionist program here. But I'm kind of getting bored of this phony war on social media and videos and celebrity endorsements and things. I'm thinking, this has no bearing on any decision that's made. if you want to put something on social media, put your bid document out there so we can all read it. Go on, have a laugh at it, so we can make our own minds up. I mean, I'll move on to John Wilkins' comments in a moment, but I don't want to say it's unseemly, but it just seems pointless to an extent. I mean, everything's pointless.
You're probably asking the wrong person, because clearly social media is not meant for the likes of me. I understand why they would do it. I think there's some commendable creativity in some of the stuff that we're seeing, but it doesn't alter the basis of the bid. I'm pretty sure Lord Jonathan Kane is not sat at home scrolling through Twitter going, oh, York have produced a lovely video. That's going to elevate them up the scale. It will be what it will be. We're in the process now. They're all preparing their bid documents. We'll hear by the middle of December which one is gone for. I am a fan of Toronto reapplying for the position that they relinquished. I think if you're serious about who has got the best bid, match up against their bid. But let's let a decision be made. I think we now know the 5 teams from League One that are going to be bidding to be in the Championship, which he checks his newspaper because he can't remember. Barrow, Doncaster, Newcastle, Rochdale and Workington. And again, I think some of them have been putting out some things on social media, and we shall see. Our opinion will count for little. I would quite like to see Newcastle, if they've got the resource, given a leg up to the Championship, but I respect the history and tradition of the teams that are also in the mix. And I don't know who the winner is if you look at the candidates for the 12th club. I think there's an issue, I think, that says you almost need a team that is proven at playing at that level, because it's going to be a difficult ask with half the amount of money and less recruitment time. So I think whilst there are a couple of candidates in there who are making great bids on social media, that it's a lot tougher on the field than producing something from a drone that looks fantastic. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. We talked about this the other week, and there are flaws. It's going to be tough.
Greg Dyke's come out for York as well, which is good. It's a shame that he didn't come out for Rugby League when he was running ITV back in the 80s and put some more on nationally as opposed to just going out.
I cannot wait for Featherstone to unveil Brian Barwick.
John Wilkin, who was on the excellent Radio Manchester Rugby League show yesterday. Rugby League Extra, I think it's called, isn't it? If you want to put in Lee again, right, I'm not joking, but from an outside perspective, it adds nothing to the game, said John Wilkin of the media these days, which upset Derek Beaumont. So Derek Beaumont versus John Wilkin on Judge Rinder coming up soon, I guess. It's just, and whatever decision is made, it's still going to cause more bother going forward, isn't it?
I mean, John and Martin Vickers did a press conference at the beginning of last week to unveil the GoFundMe page for mainly the Toronto staff and the fringe players who have had nothing for 6 or 7 months. I saw some people railing against that, but clearly a worthy cause. I think the issue is if you get bogged down by naming teams, you miss the point. And I think what John is trying to say, and certainly what Brian McDermott was trying to say, very, very eloquently, I must say, using phrases like, Brian pointed out that if the terms and conditions for application to Super League were 25 years ago, they were set at a much higher bar than they are now. And I think he used the frame that smacks of the game walking into oblivion, were his words. Very, very powerful stuff. And I think that if you move away from naming individual teams, you get to the core of the issue, and that is we should be talking about structure and policy and vision and documents that are not about one team in any one given year who may be in one division or another, but actually a view for the sport. And I don't want to overly plug 4020 magazine out. But there is a piece in there by Eddie Waring. And I think we may even have mentioned this last week, that some people have now clearly read, because I've had some very kind feedback correspondence on it. But what Eddie said was exactly 70 years ago, and about expansion and the reasons why it wasn't working and wouldn't work. And they're exactly the same reasons that we're talking about all this time later. I think when it's the reasons that are wrong, not the clubs, because clearly he was talking about a different set of clubs. He was talking about a Blackpool that didn't even exist at the time. You know, we could expand to Blackpool. What a great idea. Sheffield. But it didn't work then, and it hasn't worked now, because the fundamentals behind it are wrong, and there isn't a vision and a strategy and a plan and a stepping back from vested interest. And that, for me, is the issue, not whether it should be Lee or Featherstone or Bradford or Newcastle or Barrow. I think if you get bogged down talking about individual clubs, you miss the point. And I think what John is trying to do is talk about value and worth, and what people bring to rather than take out of the sport. And that's nothing to do with a Derek Beaumont, who's put more than most into the sport and should be lauded for doing that. It's about, what are we trying to achieve here? What do we want as a sport? What's the offering to the outside world, and how is it enhanced?
I should get Doidgy to read out that article in his Eddie Waring impression and put that out. I'm sure he owes me a favour.
With the children.
Yeah, with the children. I'll have a word with him. So the magazine is out. I've got mine. It's in the other room. I should have brought it in with me. And it's available in all good shops that are open still. And of course, you can order it online and make sure.
And as of next week, all shops will be open.
Yay! So. Unless you're in tier 3 plus something. Well, there's a vaccine now, so it's all right. Apart from the people who don't want to take it, but. I'm in isolation. I'm going to go mad by next week. I think when we record again later this week, I may have, gone full Lord of the Flies. I don't know. and I think, oh, you're very well read. No, I had to do it for GCSE English, so very, very much the piggy of this situation. Very much so. Not Ralph. Why I can remember that, having not fought that book for 20-something years, I don't know, but I've impressed myself, and I think that's as good a place as any to stop for the minute. So we'll talk about the Man of Steel when we're back later in the week, when we'll have our Saints-related guest, and enjoy the next 2 days of grand final build-up. And as you said earlier, fingers crossed, nothing goes wrong this week, because I don't know. Phil, thank you as ever.
See you in the week.
Yeah, I'm hoping Brian's left you some cake from yesterday. Or was it all gone?
There was some cake yesterday.
This job. We was here and we will be again. Like, share, subscribe, do all the things you're supposed to do. And to Keith on Facebook, I'm not cutting my hair off. Yes, it's stupid, but I'm stuck inside and I don't care. So, tough. The viewer is not always right. That'll do. I'm going to go at my hair. Oh, good.
Lovely ending.